as you can see, I've switched over to our lecture slides. This is just going to make it easier for us to talk about how we can graph price elasticity of demand. So when demand is relatively elastic, this means that consumers and quantity demanded are more sensitive to changes in price. And what we'll see is that this makes our demand curve relatively flat. On the other hand, if demand is relatively inelastic, we're much less sensitive to price changes, and our demand curve is going to be steeper. So we're going to go through 4 examples here. We're going to have some extreme cases included in those. And our first example here will actually be one of those extreme cases. And so this extreme case is called perfect inelasticity. So when we say that demand is perfectly inelastic, what we mean is that quantity demanded doesn't change at all in response to a change in price. So this is something that's like a perfect necessity. It's something that you have to buy, that you can't live without, so it doesn't matter how much the price changes, you're going to buy the same exact quantity. So that's what we're showing here on our graph by drawing this perfectly vertical demand curve. So this demand curve is drawn on the same set of axes as we always have. Quantity is on the x-axis and price is on the y-axis. But instead of drawing our demand curve as a downward sloping line, now it's this perfectly vertical demand curve. And so this helps us to represent that for any change in the price, there's no change in our quantity demanded. Doesn't matter what the price is, we're always going to buy the same exact amount. Now, if we were calculating price elasticity of demand, the way that we would know that we have perfectly inelastic demand is that we would end up with an answer of 0. So I have a shortened version of our price elasticity of demand formula up here. So the top is the percentage change in our quantity demanded. The bottom is our percentage change in the price. And so if there's no change in our quantity demanded in response to a change in price, then we're going to have a 0 in the top of our fraction. Then our whole answer is 0, and we know we have perfectly inelastic demand. All right, next up, we have a less extreme case. This is relatively inelastic demand. So now we're drawing a new demand curve, but remember that when demand is more inelastic, it's less responsive to changes in price, and this is going to give us a steeper demand curve. So what we see here is that for a change in price, we see a relatively small change in our quantity demanded. So we're going to have a small change in quantity demanded in response to some larger change in price. This is relatively inelastic demand. In our formula, we would have a small percentage change in quantity demanded on the top and a big percentage change in quantity demanded on the bottom. When we're looking for relatively inelastic demand, recall that we're looking for an absolute value of our price elasticity of demand that is less than 1. Small change in quantity demanded for a big change in price. All right, next up, we have relatively elastic demand. So as our demand becomes more elastic, it becomes less inelastic, we're more responsive to changes in price, and our demand curve is getting flatter. So in this example, we're going to have a very big change in quantity demanded in response to a small change in price. So for some small change in our price, we're having a much larger change in quantity demanded. So I'm missing a little dotted line here, but for this small change in price, we're having a big drop in quantity demanded. And with our formula, we're going to look for an absolute value of our price elasticity of demand that is greater than 1. All right, our last case here is another extreme example, and this is what we call perfectly elastic demand. So this is when demand is extremely sensitive to changes in price. If the price changes at all, then consumers aren't going to buy any of this good. It's either all or nothing. They're going to buy it. If the price changes, they're not going to buy it at all. So when we're calculating our price elasticity of demand, we would have perfectly elastic demand if our percentage change in the price ends up being 0. And this is going to give us an answer that's not mathematically possible. It's going to give us an answer of negative infinity. We can do some calculation examples to show what this looks like. But really what we're seeing here is a perfectly flat, perfectly horizontal demand curve. So if our price changes at all, we have an extreme change. Our quantity demanded is going to jump to 0 for any price above this, acceptable price of P0 where our demand curve is set. Now, a great example for a good that has perfectly elastic demand is money. So if I said, hey, I have a $1 bill, I'll sell it to you for $1. You're going to say that's weird, but you're going to say yes, right? Because $1 is worth $1, so it's a fair trade. But if I said to you, hey, I have a $1 bill, and I'm going to sell it to you for $1.01, you're going to look at me like I'm crazy, right? You're not going to buy $1 and pay $1.01 for it, right? Because then you're spending more than you're getting back. So money is a good example of this. You'll buy as many dollars as you want from me for the price of $1, but as soon as I raise the price to $1.01, no deal, you're not going to buy any dollars from me. So this is an example of perfectly elastic demand. What we have here is just a summary of everything that we've talked about so far for the price elasticity of demand. So starting on the right, we have our two formulas that we can use to calculate the price elasticity of demand. We have our simple percent change formula, and we have our midpoint method formula. Now, when you're looking at a problem, the way that you can tell which formula you need to use just depends on the information that you're given. So if in the problem, I only give you the percent change in quantity demanded and the percent change in price, then you know that you'll use this simple formula on the bottom. On the other hand, if I give you an old price and a new price, and an old quantity demanded and a new quantity demanded, then you'll know that you need to use the midpoint method formula. Now, there's a handful of practice problems for the midpoint method formula in the lecture slides that are posted on Canvas. Next, we have our different conditions that help us to determine whether demand for a good is elastic or inelastic based on our calculation of the price elasticity of demand. So we'd say that demand for a good is relatively elastic if the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. Then we have our other case here where we'd say that demand for a good is relatively inelastic if the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. Then we have a couple special cases. We have the case of perfectly elastic demand, where our price elasticity of demand coefficient is negative infinity, and the way that we would know this is the case when we do our calculations is that we have a 0 in the denominator or a 0 in the bottom of our fraction. We also have the case of perfectly inelastic demand, which happens when our price elasticity of demand is equal to 0, or when we have a 0 in the top or the numerator of our fraction. Another special case that we have is something called unitary elasticity. So unitary elasticity happens when our price elasticity of demand coefficient is equal to exactly -1, or when the absolute value of our price elasticity of demand coefficient is equal to 1. We call this unitary elastic because it means that for every 1% change in price, we have an opposite exact 1% change in quantity demanded. So for a unitary elastic good, if the price went up by 10%, quantity demanded would fall by 10%. They equally balance each other out. The last thing I want to point out is how we can remember whether the demand curve should be steep or flat for elastic or inelastic demand. So we said that when demand is more inelastic, we're less sensitive to changes in price, and our demand curve is going to be steeper. So I've drawn an extreme example of a perfectly inelastic demand curve here in blue, and we can remember this by looking at the word inelastic and seeing that the I starts with a very strong vertical line, right? So inelastic, vertical, steep demand curve. On the other hand, if we're looking at elastic demand, we're going to have a much flatter demand curve that illustrates that quantity demanded is more sensitive to a change in price. So in this case, we can look at the lines in the letter E, and we see that they're horizontal, so we know that our demand curve should be flatter, or in the case of perfect elasticity, it'll be completely flat. All right, now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about a couple different types of elasticity. So So first, we're going to stick with the demand side of things, and we're going to talk about two other types of elasticity related to demand. The first one is going to be income elasticity, and the income elasticity of demand is used to measure how a change in income is going to affect our spending or our demand. So in chapter 3, we learned that a change in income can shift our demand curve, right? But now we want to measure how much that change in income is going to shift demand. So when we calculate income elasticity, we're going to use a simple percent change formula. So E sub I is going to be used to represent our income elasticity of demand, and we'll calculate our income elasticity of demand by dividing our percentage change in the quantity demanded by our percentage change in income. We'll do a practice problem for this in just a little bit, but first I want to point out the different conditions that we can have for our income elasticity of demand. So when we talked about how income can shift the demand curve, we had two scenarios. We had normal goods, where increases in income lead to an increase in demand, and we had inferior goods, where an increase in income led to a decrease in demand. So we're going to be able to illustrate that same idea here using our income elasticity of demand. So our income elasticity of demand can be positive or it can be negative. When our income elasticity is positive, then we know that we're looking at a normal good. Some increase in our income is going to lead to a positive change in quantity demanded. As our incomes go up, we're choosing to buy more. So that's a normal good. Then within a normal good, there are two sorts of special cases. We have luxury goods and necessity goods. So a luxury good is going to have a very high income elasticity of demand. This is a product where when your income rises, all of a sudden you're going to start buying a whole lot more of it. So we could think about sushi or steak or maybe a private jet as a luxury good, where once your income starts to go up, now you're going to buy a whole lot more of that new luxury. Our other type of normal good is a necessity. So a necessity is just something that you need to live, but as your income goes up, you're probably going to buy more of it. So a necessity good would have an income elasticity of demand somewhere between 0 and 1. So it's still going to be positive, but it's not going to be a very large number. Our change in quantity demanded in response to an increase in income is still positive, but it's pretty modest. All right, and then our other case here is that of an inferior good. So an inferior good is one for which your income rises and your quantity demanded actually falls. So this could be things like public transportation or instant ramen, cup of noodles. These are things where they're popular with people who are maybe trying to save money, maybe have a lower income, but as soon as your income goes up, you might abandon these inferior goods for higher quality, maybe luxury goods. So for an inferior good, our income elasticity of demand is going to be negative. As your income increases, we're going to have a negative change in our quantity demanded. Now let's do a quick example. All right, so I've written up here a shortened or abbreviated version of our simple percent change formula for the income elasticity of demand. This triangle here is called delta. It's a Greek letter, and we just use it to represent change. So what this says here is to calculate our income elasticity of demand, we're going to divide our percentage change in quantity demanded by our percentage change in income. And our example problem is right here. It says, suppose that your income increases by 20%, but as a result, you're going to buy 15% less ground beef. So let's first calculate our income elasticity of demand for our good in question, which is ground beef, and then we'll use that answer to figure out whether ground beef is a normal good or an inferior good. All right, so all I'm going to do is plug in my given information into my formula to get my answer. So what this problem is telling me is that my income has increased by 20%. So on the bottom of my fraction, I'm going to have a positive 20% change. Then as a result, I'm buying 15% less ground beef. So I have a negative change in my quantity demanded. So my quantity demanded changes by negative 15%. All right, and so my answer here, after I cancel out my percentage symbols, because I have one on the top and one on the bottom, is going to be negative 3/4 or negative 0.75. All right, and so what this answer means is that for every 1% increase in my income, my quantity of ground beef that I demand goes down by 0.75%. So let me go ahead and write that here. So the way that I interpret my answer for my income elasticity of demand for ground beef is that for a 1% increase in my income, my quantity demanded of ground beef falls by 0.75%. So when my income went up, my demand for ground beef fell. So we already know intuitively that ground beef must be an inferior good. This is confirmed by the fact that our income elasticity of demand for ground beef is less than 0. We have a negative number as our answer, so we know that ground beef must be an inferior good. Our last elasticity that we're going to discuss in terms of demand is called the cross-price elasticity of demand. So we know from our supply and demand chapter that some goods are related to one another in terms of their consumption, so that a change in the price of one good can affect demand for another related good. So our cross-price elasticity of demand is going to measure that sensitivity between the price of one good and demand for another good. So the way that we're going to calculate our cross-price elasticity, again, we're just going to use this simple percentage change formula. So the way that we calculate this is we're going to measure the percentage change in the quantity demanded of good A and divide that by the percentage change in the price of good B. So we're measuring a change in the quantity demanded of one good relative to the change in the price of another good. All right, and so depending on whether our goods are substitutes or complements, our cross-price elasticity of demand can either be positive or negative. For substitute goods, we're going to have a positive cross-price elasticity of demand. This is because when one good becomes more expensive, this is going to encourage consumers to buy more of that substitute. On the other hand, if our two goods are complementary in terms of their consumption, we're going to have a negative cross-price elasticity of demand. As a complement becomes more expensive, then it's going to discourage people from buying the goods that they would consume with that complement. Unrelated goods are, of course, going to have a cross-price elasticity of 0 because there will be no relationship between the change in the price of one good and the quantity demanded of that other good. All right, so here's a quick example for cross-price elasticity of demand. This problem says that when the price of Coca-Cola increases, people purchase more Pepsi. Then it asks us to determine whether Coke and Pepsi are complements or substitutes. So intuitively, we know that Coca-Cola and Pepsi are substitutes, but if we want to quickly do this using our new cross-price elasticity of demand concept here, this is telling us that the price of Coca-Cola has increased and people have purchased more Pepsi. So we don't have any numbers for this problem, but we can still use our formula to figure this out. So Pepsi is going to act as our good B. Coca-Cola is acting as our good B because we have a change in the price of Coca-Cola. So the price of Coca-Cola is increasing, so we have some positive number here on the bottom of our fraction, and as a result, people are purchasing more Pepsi. So Pepsi is our good A in this situation because we have a change in the quantity that is being purchased. The quantity of Pepsi demanded increases when the price of Coca-Cola increases. So even though we don't have numbers, we have positive values for our changes in both our numerator and our denominator. And so what this tells us is that our final answer here is going to be positive, or it's going to be greater than 0. And so from this, we know that Coca-Cola and Pepsi must be substitutes. Finally, we're going to talk about one elasticity on the supply side, and that is the price elasticity of supply. So just like demand, supply is also sensitive to changes in price. Our producers also care about prices. So our price elasticity of supply is going to measure how sensitive quantity supply is to a change in the price. So for a specific good, we want to see how much will quantity supply change if we have some change in price. Now, if our supply is considered to be elastic, what this means is that the quantity supplied for a good responds very significantly to a price change. Let's say that the price of lemonade increases by 10%, and then lemonade suppliers increase their quantity supplied by 50%. That's a very strong response in response to that price change. On the other hand, if our supply is inelastic, this means that the quantity supplied for a good responds only very little to a change in price. So let's say for that same 10% price increase on lemonade, producers only increase their supply by 5%. So quantity supplied in that case is not very sensitive to a change in price. Now for us to calculate our price elasticity of supply, we can use this simple percent change formula. So we're just going to take our percentage change in quantity supplied and divide it by our percentage change in price. Now, because of our law of supply, the price elasticity of supply will always be positive. And this is because with everything else held constant, price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. They have a positive relationship. So if the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied of that good will also increase. If the price of a good decreases, the quantity supplied of that good will also decrease. What this means is that in our price elasticity of supply formula, we'll always have either a positive and a positive, or a negative and a negative, so our answer will always be positive. The last thing we want to talk about for price elasticity of supply are the conditions under which we consider the supply for a good to be elastic or inelastic. So when we calculate our price elasticity of supply to be greater than 1, we would say that the supply for this good is relatively elastic. Producers are relatively sensitive to changes in price, and they will alter their quantity supplied pretty significantly when they experience a price change. On the other hand, we would say that the supply for a good is relatively inelastic if we calculate our price elasticity of supply to be less than 1. What this means is that producers are relatively unresponsive to a change in price. Quantity supplied doesn't change very much in response to a price change. Then we do have a special condition for the price elasticity of supply, and that is to say that we consider supply to be perfectly inelastic if we calculate our price elasticity of supply to be 0. What this means is that for any change in price, there's absolutely no change in quantity supplied. We'd have a 0 in the numerator of our fraction. So it doesn't matter how much the price changes, producers are not changing their quantity supplied at all. Alright guys, that's it for our video today on elasticity. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me over email. I recommend doing a bunch of practice problems to get comfortable with the formulas for calculating elasticities and memorizing the different sort of rules for understanding whether demand is elastic or inelastic, or whether something is a normal or an inferior good. So please just reach out to me if you have any questions. Thanks.